So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into how do you actually add some of the things that Carlos was talking about into your applications. Can everyone see my screen here? Ron, can you see it over there? I should say, it should be the screen that says adding intelligence to your applications, hopefully.
Yes, I can see that fine. I'm
Awesome.
just going to also check the questions. You know, come on, everyone, even out there in Angel Beat Virtual Land, type in a couple of questions. Let me know what you think. Is this useful? I hope so. Make sure you can see Brian's screen. Send me a text or an email. Just make sure of that so we know we're hitting the mark. All right, good. I'm glad Isaac says yes and others. So I think we're in good shape. Don't hesitate to ask questions real time during this comprehensive Microsoft session. We should be good to go, Brian.
All right, thanks, Ron. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about a few different things. As I mentioned before, you know, AI can be very theoretical from time to time, and what I'm going to do is just sort of dive into how you actually build applications and plug artificial intelligence, machine learning, and scale it as well. So plug it into your applications and scale it. And to do that, we're going to talk a little bit about Azure Functions. I'm going to show you how to use enterprise messaging for your app and why you want to. And we're going to talk about logic apps, which is a way to sort of organize things. And I'm going to add cognitive services. And then I'll wrap it all up with a summary. So we got 30 minutes. I'm going to dive right into a demo. I'm going to show you the demo of everything I'm going to show you today, and then I'm going to explain how I built it. I'm going to use Azure Functions, something called Event Grid, something called Logic Apps, and Cognitive Services to do something kind of fun. Let me see here. All right, so what I've got here, I've got a bunch of pictures. And what I want to do is each time I load these pictures, I want to create a thumbnail, and I also want to have an abstract, you know, an alt text for your thumbnail, which is really important for accessibility and other things as well. And I want all that to be automatic when it's uploaded to my website. Plus, on top of that, if there's a million people uploading pictures to my website, I want it to scale as well. So how do I actually do this? Well, I've got a way to do it. I like to, you can see my pictures here. I like to mess with my artificial intelligence a little bit sometimes. So I've got some really kind of weird pictures here that artificial intelligence should have a little trouble with. So let's give it a try. I'll try loading one of these. I'm going to use something called Storage Explorer, which is a free open source tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into blob storage here. So I've got a blob storage where I can actually store my files. And this would be something you would add on to your application. And you don't have to touch your underlying application code because it actually kind of runs in parallel. So let's say you have a website and you want to have a way to upload pictures, create a thumbnail, do a caption. I'll just show you how that all works here. So I'm going to upload a file. And let's just pick that dog picture that I had there. Okay, there we go. Open. I'm going to upload it, and it doesn't just upload the picture. You'll see it here in a second. It also creates a thumbnail. So here we go. There we go. So instantly, it's created this is the original picture, and it's created a thumbnail of that picture as well. So you can display it on a grid or whatever you want to do with it. But if I go into the item as well, if I double click on this, oops, we looked at the actual picture. Okay, properties. If I go into properties, down here, oops, in the metadata, oh, it didn't do it yet. Normally it updates. Okay, hold on. Properties. No, it didn't do it yet. Okay, maybe it had trouble with that one. Let's try another one. Upload files. All right, let's do this guy with a chariot. Open, upload. All right. It's supposed to actually add a caption there as well. For some reason it didn't. Maybe it just had too much trouble with that one. Yeah, there we go. So I guess it had trouble with that dog picture, But this one, it says person wearing a costume. So it's kind of handy because for a lot of websites these days, in fact, there's some regulations in some cases where you need an alt text for your image. You need a description for it when you actually upload it. So this automatically goes and does that. And it uses cognitive services for that. So what we did here actually behind the scenes is automatically when I upload the picture, it runs something called Azure Function, which is a serverless application that creates this thumbnail for us. On top of that, it went out to artificial intelligence and it looked at the picture, compared it to a whole range of pictures that it already has in place, and then it added a description of what it thinks it should be. And I guess for this one, we had it stumped for dog dentistry, so it wouldn't do it. But for the chariot, it figured out it's a man wearing a costume, which is, close enough. There are ways to train your models to make sure that the descriptions are a little bit better. Obviously, man wearing a costume is a little vague for that particular picture. But you can actually train your models. And I think Bala, Kumal, and Pallavi will be touching on models and training later on in this series today. So anyway, that's the demo. And let's actually go in and show you how I did this. And the way I did it is kind of cool. I used Azure Functions, Event Grid, Logic Apps, and Cognitive Services. And by the way, this was scaled to literally millions of pictures. If there were millions of pictures being uploaded right now, it would actually handle it. And even if my app went down, it would store the pictures and wait to process them until my app came back up. And that's what you do with Event Grid. And then I have Logic Apps, which actually orchestrates the functions and the Event Grid and the cognitive services together. So let's dive into how those components are all put together. The first part of it is Azure Functions. So people are, by now probably know a lot about serverless. It's an abstract of servers. It's event-driven and it scales instantly, and it has micro-billing as well. Those are the three main functions, the main features of any serverless application, in this case, Azure Functions. But the real thing about Azure Functions, it is a combination of code and events. And that's the thing to remember about functions if you're looking into building them and why you want to use them. There's a whole bunch of triggers. In this case, when something gets added to blob storage, I have a webhook that's watching for that activity, that event to happen, and it actually triggers the event. So I can go into my blob storage here. So this is my Azure portal that I'm showing you here. And I have several things in a resource group. A resource group is how you organize things in Azure. And what I've got here, the first thing I want to show you is storage. So inside of my storage account that I just showed you, we have different events. If you look at the actual events themselves, let's go into wedge list subscription, for example. I can set up triggers, and those triggers talk to functions. In this case, if I go into filters, you can see here, anytime a blob is created, you call an event grid, and the event grid is the part that scales this. I'll deal with the details of that later. But I can do blob created, deleted, a directory created or deleted, or a blob renamed or a directory renamed. I can actually trigger any one of those things. And there's a bunch of other triggers you can do inside of Azure to make your functions work. So just bookmark that. So in this case, blob storage is one trigger I have. I also have Cosmos DB, event hubs, an HTTP request, queues, service books. You can do something automatically like timers and other things. And what you do is you bind that to something. So in this case, we have a trigger of blob storage, adding something in, and then the binding binds it to an Azure function. And that Azure function actually makes the cognitive services call and a few other things. All right, so the Azure serverless platform components. So we have the functions, and the functions basically just do anything you'd like them to do. You can write code in .NET. There's a whole bunch of ways to build things with existing integrations as well. On top of that, we have logic apps, because sometimes you want to orchestrate, and in this case we do want to orchestrate your functions into an application that follows multiple steps. And then you have Event Grid. An Event Grid is what stores and manages your functions and your logic app to make sure that you don't lose any data if something goes wrong, or in the case that you have just a huge amount of volume. On top of that, the whole platform that we have has access to Azure and non-Azure components as well. In this case, database storage, security, et cetera, et cetera. And all that can be managed through IDE support. You can use Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, or your favorite text editor to make this work. We've got integrated DevOps with Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions. And you can do local development, and there's really, really good ways to do monitoring and debug things as well. All right, so Azure Event Grid. I mentioned before, how do you actually scale things and make sure that your application that, you know, if you have 1,000 people uploading pictures and you're doing some maintenance on your application, you can take your application down and then bring it back up, and all of those image tasks that were created during the downtime will be run when the app comes back up. So how do you actually set that up? And that's with something like Azure Event Grid. It's fully managed event routing, near real-time event delivery at scale, and it has Azure and other cloud platforms coverage as well. Now, modern computing is all about events. This is just one example, creating this image and thumbnail and adding a caption to it, but there's all kinds of more important events that you might want to capture as well. Like a new file comes in, you need to process that file for the accounting system that's running on your applications. Up till now, managing these events is important, but if you want to handle them yourself on-prem or even in the cloud, you need to manage machines or virtual machines and all the processing that needs to be done for networking and clustering and things like that. But Event Grid is a great way to just manage everything in one place, in a central location, where you can have a whole bunch of events that are being processed worldwide. So you can set up event grids and have them replicated all over the world through all of our different data centers, and it's complete disaster recovery. So if you have an application or a business that depends on logistics, on files being processed, the great way to handle that is through Event Grid. So as I mentioned before, you've got event publishers. In this case, we've got blob storage, but you can also use other things and custom events as well. And what happens is the handlers will then call Azure Functions, logic apps, and things like that. So the example I used earlier is, and this is the most common example, is you've got an application. You don't want to touch your core application, but you want to start adding more reliability and more functionality to it. It's a very common use case. And the way you do that is you can build an event grid externally to your application, which handles all of the transaction processing, and then have Azure Functions, logic apps, and other things that trigger application activity when they need to, without changing the underlying application. So if you do that, then you're just focusing on how do we actually make our transactions more efficient versus how do I actually get my transaction processing to scale. And it's just more reliable that way, and you can build applications and capabilities that you might not have thought of before. So here's a couple scenarios. This is the one that I'm showing you today, which is serverless app. So I trigger a serverless function when something goes into a blob storage. You can do things like ops automation as well. So anytime there's activity or a new login from a different location on your application, you can check and make sure that it's compliant and that it's an actual inside a whitelist or some other way of managing that. You also have ways to connect your application. In this case, once again, the example I'm using is you would have an event grid, a logic app, and functions that run entirely outside of your existing application, but they enhance the capabilities. So the most important thing to remember here is really you have 99.99% availability with Event Grid, 100 million subscriptions per region per day, 10 million events per second per region, and you have transparent regional failover. So you could have an event grid that's running in North America and one in Australia and Europe, and if one of those fails, for whatever reason, it's going to fail over to the other one. And the other important thing is you've got 24-hour retry and back off for events not delivered. So you're never going to miss a picture. You're never going to miss a file or a transaction this way. It's really compared to the kinds of systems that I've seen built into local on-prem and even other cloud systems that are built from scratch. This is just a great way to manage your reliability and scalability of anything you're doing with transaction processing. All right. So the next thing I want to show you is Azure Logic Apps. And Azure Logic Apps are actually powerful integration workflow engine. You use a visual designer and you connect your applications and data and services together. And you can orchestrate Azure Functions and other things as well. There are hundreds of connectors for integration inside of that. So when you're working with Logic Apps, you can connect to Microsoft or third-party connections that are built in. Twitter's a good one, but there are literally hundreds of connectors you can use that are pre-built for integration that you can just use right out of the box when you're building and orchestrating your workflows. It has a visual workflow designer, and let me just show you that instead of talking about it. It's probably the easiest thing to do. All right. So here's my Logic app that I actually built for this application. It's got a connection. The connection is the trigger. It's going through Event Grid, so it's scalable. And what we do is when we get that application trigger, in this case, I upload a file to blob storage. It actually parses out, it goes out and it grabs the blob, it gets some metadata, it grabs the string and an object. The object is actually the original JPEG picture itself. And from that, we have a function that's called, and that function makes a thumbnail automatically of the picture. Next thing we want to do is we want to add that caption. To add the caption, we have a condition here. If this particular item, because it's cycling through all the items in my storage, if this particular item contains wish list, which is the value that I've chosen to upload to in this particular case, and it's not a thumbnail. So each thumbnail automatically gets underscore thumb added to the file name. So if it's not a thumbnail, but it's an original picture and it's part of the wish list blob, then what we want to do is we want to get that blob, and then we're going to describe the image content, and we're going to pass that to cognitive services. And in this case, cognitive services, I'll get back to that in a second, but cognitive services will go out and use Microsoft computer vision to analyze that picture, compare it against other pictures that it has values for, and give a guess of what that actual picture is. So that's how it works. It's actually built in a visual designer, and that's how it actually gets designed. There's some code in there as well that I won't go into detail, partly because it's 30 minutes and we're keeping this at a higher level, but there's a link I'm going to show at the end where you can get all the code. You can actually recreate this entire demo if you're so interested. So last but not least, cognitive services. I want to talk a little bit about that. So Microsoft has cognitive services, which is vision, the one we're using today. We also have speech, so you can actually identify speech. Language, which is really amazing. It translates websites. You can translate text that comes in. You can do chat, real-time translation. We have an actual facility. If you go to translate.it, if you're doing a presentation like this today, you can actually have people download an app and they can actually view this presentation being translated in real time into their own language, which is pretty cool. I've done that before in Korea and Japan, where I was giving the talk in English and people were watching their phones to see the actual translation in real time of the presentation. It's not always perfect because it's real time, but it is actually amazingly accurate. Okay, we also have search and labs. So labs is a way to try our new technologies as well. So I mentioned before we have cognitive services. So how do I actually add cognitive services to my logic app here? Well, I just go in here, right here. I can actually, got to move. You guys probably can't see it, but as a presenter, I've got this little thing in my right side. There we go. So so I can actually create. In this case, I go out, I retrieve, I send the picture to cognitive services, and I send it through a key. And from there, I get a caption, which is a list of captions actually generated by this. But there are other things I can do with this as well. If I want to, there's collections, there's all kinds of information about the size of the image and other related information that you can get from computer vision as well. The way I set that up is in cognitive vision, it's called computer vision, but cognitive services computer vision, I can actually create a item inside of my Azure portal using my Azure subscription, and it gives me an endpoint and it gives me a key. So I have my own unique endpoint. I can send things to cognitive services and get back values if I pass it the endpoint and the key, which is built into the Logic app for me. And there's a free tier, which is actually what I'm using, where it allows you to do a certain amount of queries for free, and that goes for all of the cognitive services that we have. All right. So I showed you a very high level how to use Azure Functions to scale and extend your app and scale your actual messaging and transactions that manage that app using Event Grid. And then Logic Apps to actually put everything together, build the function that would scale if we needed it to, and deliver the thumbnail and the cognitive services caption back, and how to add cognitive services and cloud intelligence. All of the demos and the decks that you see today, and a lot more detail actually, are at ACA-MS Mod 30. You can actually recreate this demo from scratch. It uses a bunch of different functions. It'll work with a free Azure subscription, and a lot of the things I use are the free tier of services on Azure anyway. So that's it. So in summary, just a little quick demo of how to actually build your application and add intelligence to your application as well. And I'm Brian Benz, I'm Cloud Advocate at Microsoft, and please do follow me on Twitter.